Hello, good morning. You're very welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Mark Gibson. I'm Program Manager of the Teagasc Connected Programme. Today we'll be talking about the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on Irish agriculture. And I'm going to hand over now to the chair of this session, Jerry Boyle. Just before I do so, remind you that you can ask questions for participants to our panel through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be getting to questions at the end of the session. So I'll hand over to our Director of Teagasc, Professor Jerry Boyle.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning again to everyone. We're delighted to have such a large number listening into this important webinar. The webinar is principally about the impact of COVID-19 on the agricultural economy, but we're delighted to also have as a guest speaker, Professor Kieran McQuinn from the ESRI, who's responsible for the production of their quarterly economic commentary, and was a macroeconomist with the ESRI. And of course, formerly, Kieran was a member of the Capri Ireland team here at Teagasc, and also a senior economist at the Central Bank. And Kieran's presentation will be followed by three presentations from my colleagues. First of all, Kevin Hanrahan, who is head of the Rural and Economic Development Programme at Teagasc, and by his colleague then, Fiona Thorne, and finally by Trevor Donnellan. And as Mark said, we really welcome people to use the Q&A facility, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions. So we propose to have each of the presenters make their presentations, and then we will have a question and answer session at the end. Okay, thank you, and enjoy the seminar.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry, and thank you very much to the people organising the webinar for the invitation to present. This, as Jerry and Mark said, I'll present basically the latest quarterly economic commentary, which we published just actually this morning. People may have heard some elements of it already in the media this morning. So what I'm going to do over the next 10 or 11 minutes is just give an overview as to how we see the economy evolve for the rest of the year. And basically what we've done is to follow an approach that we took in our first commentary concerning COVID-19, which was back in March. And in that, we basically postponed, if you like, our usual forecast approach. So typically what we do in the economic commentary is we forecast how we would see the economy evolve for this year and next year. This time around, what we're doing is we're availing of scenario analysis. And the reason we take scenario analysis is because of the considerable uncertainty, which is obviously still there concerning the evolution of the virus and obviously the related measures then to curtail the spread of the virus. And so as a result, what we do is we perform three scenarios in terms of how we see the economy evolving over the next 6 to 9 months. We conduct, the first one is our what we call the baseline or the new normal. This is the one which we think is the most likely to occur. And that's essentially parameterized off the government's plan, the if you like, 5-phase plan through to August of this year in terms of restarting the economy and the related measures associated with that. What that also assumes is that through quarters 3 and 4, we have what's called the new normal. And the new normal essentially means that we have social and physical distancing around economic activity. So we do not have a full return, if you like, to normal economic activity for the rest of the year. It's the new normal where we have social and physical distancing through Q3 and Q4. Our second scenario is a benign one. We call it the pandemic suppression. And in this case, we do have a return to full normal economic activity in Q4 of the year. So we're basically assuming that there's a very effective suppression of the disease through testing, tracing, targeted quarantine, etc. And that enables the economy to basically return to full economic activity, full normal economic activity in the final quarter. The final scenario is what we call our severe or second wave scenario. So in that, we assume that basically there is a return of the virus in autumn of this year, and that necessitates a lockdown, a further lockdown, a 12-week lockdown in the autumn. And that, of course, reflects the fact that we've obviously, in all scenarios, had a 12-week lockdown since late March. Okay, so since late March, we've had a 12 weeks lockdown in terms of how the virus has impacted. To give the headline results first, so if you like the takeaway slide in terms of our results, and to be honest, they're very, very stark in terms of their effects. Even under the benign case, you'll see we still expect the economy to contract very sharply in 2020. So if you look at all the major headings, the consumption, private consumer expenditure, investment, exports, and of course then the bottom line in terms of GDP, you can see a very, very sharp contraction in economic activity expected for the rest of the year. So if we take just the baseline scenario, which again is, as I said, parameterized along the lines of the government's 5-phase plan to reopen the economy, even in that situation, you're expecting economic output, overall activity for the year to contract by somewhere in the region of 12%. Major areas that are facing contraction in that scenario are obviously consumption, which is down very sharply at 13%, and also investment, down at 28%. Very, very significant fall off in investment and consumption under the scenario. Trade obviously is also impacted. Demand for Irish goods and services very seriously impacted because of course the virus is impacting not just the domestic but also the international economy, and in particular some of our major trading partners. The unemployment results, again, a huge increase in unemployment in a very, very short period of time. So unemployment going literally from 4.6% in February to 28% in April. For the year as a whole, we expect the unemployment rate to be around 17% under our baseline case, but obviously that deteriorates then under the severe scenario where unemployment is expected to reach almost 20% by the end of the year. And then the bottom line, the public finances, obviously a very severe deterioration in the public finances. Particularly we focus on the baseline. So you can see that the general government balance, the actual monetary amount of the deficit is approaching 30 billion, 28 billion. And that, if anything, may be a conservative estimate. And so the overall deficit then is 9% of GDP by the end of the year. But as I said, that could indeed grow depending on how the nature of the government's response. Just to take the individual areas first, and the commentary that I'm basing the presentation on is freely available on the ESRI website and can be downloaded there. And this presentation indeed will be available for anybody who wishes to avail of it afterwards. We look at the individual areas, so we look at consumption. We focus quite a bit on consumption because this is one of the major areas in which the pandemic has impacted the domestic economy. If you think of the nature of the lockdown, the 12-week lockdown essentially that we've had to date, and if you like, the continuation of the social distancing measures, that all has very significant implications for different aspects of consumption. What we do in our approach is we basically go in and look at the individual components of consumption as per the national accounts, and we look at the impacts on the different areas, the different components of consumption under the 12-week lockdown and the subsequent relaxation of the lockdown after that. And we, on the basis of a kind of a bottom-up approach, we then work out what the overall impact is likely to be on consumption as a result for the remainder of the year. A lot of this work has been published as well as part of the Budget Perspective series that the ESRI has, which is basically a more micro-level assessment of the overall situation. So if we look at, for example, some of the major components of consumption in this table, under our three scenarios, our new normal, which is our baseline, our second wave, which is our severe, and then the pandemic suppression in the final column, you'll see the kind of percentage change from 2019 that we're looking at as a result of the COVID situation. So again, you can see consumption falling in most cases, increasing in some obviously, because there's been obviously increases in consumption at home, for example, of goods and services. But in the main, there's very significant fall off in most of the major the consumption categories, whether it's drink and tobacco, clothing and footwear, transport, durables, etc. A very significant fall off in consumption for these items, and that then allows us then to aggregate up to the overall consumption picture. Investment, again, investment is very likely to be very significantly impacted by the COVID situation. Under our baseline, we expect investment to fall by 28% this year. Again, we take a granular approach. We look at it from a bottom-up situation. We look at the individual components of investment. We try and ascertain how sensitive the individual components are likely to be to this type of shock. Maybe some items more or less sensitive than others. And we look at particularly the relationship between things like business sentiment and investment categories. And obviously the more an investment category is influenced or determined by business sentiment, the more likely it is to be impacted by the different components or by the COVID situation. Building and construction, for example, is likely to be very obviously hit by the fact that there was that it was affected by the 12-week lockdown, and obviously as well then by the social distancing measures outlined. These are all likely to impact on the degree to which building and construction will recover over the remainder of the year. On the trade situation, we're lucky in the sense that we avail of work that our colleagues in the ESRI do using the macroeconometric model COSMO. That model is linked into an international network of models, very similar to, I suppose, the FAPRI Ireland model for the agricultural sector that's maintained at Teagasc. And so by linking into an international framework of modelling, the NIGEM system of models, which is maintained by the National Institute of London, it allows us to trace through the foreign or international effects through down to the domestic economy. We take 3 scenarios in that context as well: a baseline, a benign, and a severe. In the baseline, we're looking at the impacts being essentially reaching their maximum in terms of the international community in Q2 and Q3, and then a kind of a resumption back to normal trade or reasonably normal trading patterns in Q4. Our benign scenario, we basically take a situation where we look at some of the major components of Irish exports, particularly pharma, medical devices, and we see that they're likely to be less impacted than other areas as a result of the COVID situation. And as a result then, that may cause some of our exports to hold up quite strongly in a benign situation. The severe scenario, we take a situation where there's quite a long-lasting impact of COVID-19 on the international climate. So, if you like, there's more of a diminution, if you like, of globalization, countries becoming more self-reliant based on uncertainty and response to the virus. And as a result, that leads then to a deterioration in international trade, which of course has a big impact on a small open economy such as our own. So again, we build very heavily on this analysis when we're looking at the trade impacts for the Irish economy in terms of our overall assessment. The labour market, very, very severe impact on the labour market, I suppose. If I just skip forward to the next slide, this is a plot of Irish unemployment from 1973 to the present. I've highlighted the 2 previous periods of very high unemployment. That was in the early 1980s and in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. And within the 2 black bars, what I've tried to do there is to highlight the scale of time in terms of quarters from the peak or from the trough to the peak of the unemployment shock during that period. So for instance, in the early 1980s, you can see it took 21 quarters to get from the trough of 8% unemployment up to the peak of around 16%. And again, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, it took 12 quarters to get to the peak of the unemployment shock after the relative trough at the start of the period. And of course, the present period is categorized by the sheer speed at which we have reached the high of the unemployment scale. So, you know, the April live register showed unemployment at 28%. That's coming from 4.6% in February. You could look at more severe figures in terms of if you look at the numbers on the live register, and if you were to include those who are on the wage subsidy scheme as well as those on the traditional unemployment payment and on the pandemic, you're then looking at over 1 million people on the live register as of April, which is a staggering amount, number of people. Our expectation is, under the baseline scenario, that you will get the unemployment rate on average will come back to around 17% for the year as a whole. But again, depending on the scenario, depending on the degree to which the virus is suppressed, obviously that will vary. The public finances, again, a rather grim picture in terms of the overall impact. So if you think of it, there's an impact on the revenues of the state. So all of the individual taxation headings are likely to be significantly impacted. Indirect taxes, income tax, corporation tax, which may be impacted as well. So quite a significant fall off in revenues on the revenue side, and of course a big increase in expenditure in terms of the welfare payments for things like the pandemic payments, the support for SMEs, corporates, etc. All of these leading to a substantial deficit for the year. We think somewhere in the region of 28 billion. That could grow depending on the response of the authorities and the government to the overall situation. So our assessment in terms of our policy prescription, if you like, in terms of how we see the economy or what we feel is the appropriate policy response, we think that the appropriate response in general at this stage is to try and stimulate activity, to try and, if you like, stabilize the economic situation, to stimulate economic activity, then to try and reboot the economy, reboot economic activity. One area we've suggested is in terms of environmental and sustainability projects, but also linking in then with the construction sector, and particularly the provision of social and affordable housing. This is a major issue in the economy, and maybe now there is the space to address that issue going forward. We think there's a need for clear and specific guidance from European institutions in terms of what member states can do on the borrowing front, and a clear strategy to kind of make borrowing as permissible as possible, if you like, and keeping the cost of borrowing down over the short to medium term, so that individual countries can deal with the situation in the appropriate sense and can smooth as much as possible the substantial nature of the shock. Other issues to watch out for, if we have, particularly if we have any tapering of some of the income supports, there's a real danger that you could see an increase in areas around mortgage arrears, and particularly if the payment break that the banks have extended, if those expire as well, that could lead to a significant increase in mortgage arrears, and of course that would bring with it financial stability considerations. So that's a brief overview of our assessment. There's a lot more in the commentary, and I'd be delighted to take any questions at the end of the presentation. But with that, I'll hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Kieran. My name is Kevin Hanrahan, and I'm going to start off the conversation about the outlook for agriculture. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. I'm going to screen view. Slideshow. Okay. And this is work that I've done collaboratively with my colleagues Trevor, Donnellan and Fiona Thorne. And as Kieran said there, in terms of the ESRI discussion, we're happy to take questions after this presentation is finished. So we started talking about these things internally amongst the three of us about in terms of phases, but we didn't want to confuse that with the government's plan for the phased lifting of restrictions on activity. But we know that the short-term impact on the agricultural sector and the food sector has been sort of kind of a rolling series of week by week kind of stages of impact. In that, if you cast your own mind back to February, we were watching the TV reports of this new disease in Asia, and wondering and being amazed at what was happening, and not really thinking very much about what would happen when it arrived, if it would arrive. And it did in due course, and there was some very short-run panic buying in retail outlets. But with the sort of the public health measures being introduced here in Ireland and in our key markets overseas in Europe and in the United Kingdom, we started to see consumers being locked down at home. We saw the closure of many retail outlets, including pubs and restaurants, and that negative shock to demand and to the ability of those industries to actually function and supply goods to consumers starting to be reflected in agricultural prices that farmers are getting. And in addition, then you start to see over time the sort of the macro impacts that Kieran has been talking about in terms of people being furloughed or seeing their incomes reduced because they're now on pandemic support payments. Consumer spending reduced because either they can't go out and spend in restaurants, or because their incomes have been affected, or they are increasingly anxious about their sort of medium-term income prospects, that they're starting to shift their consumption habits within the retail space as well. And we're also starting to see the food supply chain adjust to that changing demand picture, and that's starting to lead to accumulation of stocks both on farms and in the food industry. And again, this is sort of reinforcing in some sense the decline in agricultural commodity prices, which we're starting to really see, and we'll see that as we go through the presentations. Kind of a stylized fact about agriculture is that that supply is very inelastic, and that, you know, in the very short run, and we're talking here about the short run, farmers are really unable to adjust very much of what they've done. I mean, their breeding decisions last year, their planting decisions last year or early in this year are really determining the supply that they're bringing forward right now, and there's very little they can do to adjust that to the weakening of demand, and that means that supply and demand adjustment process in agricultural commodity markets in particular means that we would expect to see quite significant negative price adjustments as the way in which that supply and demand balance is maintained. So that's just a quick kind of summary of what's happening. So in the short run, food markets are probably oversupplied, and that supply-demand balance is being sort of restored with price adjustments. But the accumulation of inventories all across the supply chains in agriculture and food will mean that the recovery in prices will be delayed, and then that macro impact that Kieran has talked about very, very well will also hinder that recovery in terms of how much of the goods that agri-food produces that consumers want and what price point they're going to return to consumption at. Just to talk about the scenarios that we've analysed, they're kind of we didn't do this in sync with the ESRI, but we took a similar approach in the sense that we looked at 3 scenarios, and they range in severity similarly to the ESRI scenarios. The design of the scenarios doesn't really lend itself to saying which one is more likely. I think the more likely outcomes will differ by farming system or by agriculture sub-industry, and we're happy to discuss about that in the discussion section of this seminar. So we have differing negative price reductions across different agricultural commodity markets we're looking at. There are very limited some scope for supply adjustments at the farm level that we also build in to our scenario analysis, and a consequence of that is also some kind of concomitant adjustment in the costs of production that farmers are incurring as a result of those output volume adjustments. And we've also, into each of our scenarios, sort of introduced information about what's happened because of COVID, we think, to some of the costs of production that are driven out of the energy markets, energy prices have declined very dramatically as a result of the demand shock at a global level. And some of that can be attributed to COVID. So we've introduced that across all of our 3 scenarios, a standard kind of assumption on energy cost reductions. Focusing on beef, how we've done this is we've compared what we were forecasting for the scenario in the absence of COVID, and then looked at what we think could happen, with the pandemic we're now in the middle of. But we don't really have very much clarity, as Kieran has stressed, in terms of what the end result will be and how bad things will get. So we have a range in terms of the severity of impacts. But for beef, we just have to remember all the time that 9 out of 10 kilos of beef produced in Ireland are eaten elsewhere. They're exported. So it's really what's happening in our export markets that's driving things on the market for beef and for beef farm incomes. The European food service industry has effectively shut down, and that demand has largely disappeared for the last 3 months. And we know that the Irish beef industry, compared to other beef industries across the European Union, is more dependent on that food service channel than would be the case, say, in the UK or continental markets. Now, while retail demand has sort of taken up some of that slack, in the sense that people who previously might have been eating out are no longer able to do so, and have basically been diverted into more eating at home. What they're eating at home is qualitatively and is really different from what they would have been eating if they're eating out, in terms of the value that consumption returns to farmers. So we're seeing prices in Ireland for our kind of benchmarks, R3 steer price, down around 8%. There was a continued recovery week on week last week, so about 7% versus for week 21 versus last year. But that's a big reduction, and last year wasn't a great year for cattle prices, everybody knows. The adjustment that has happened to date is that meat processing plants who are looking at weaker demand from the food service industry in particular are basically passing on that weaker demand in terms of their demand for cattle into the factories. So overall total cattle and the prime cattle slaughter is down by more than 5% cumulatively through this year as compared to last year. And that lower kill in the factories is being reflected in some accumulation of animals that would otherwise have been slaughtered on farms. So we're talking about circa 30 to 40,000 cattle that we would have expected to see slaughtered by this stage, still being alive, still costing farmers money in terms of their maintenance. So that also is incorporated in our analysis. It's just a visual representation of the prices, the price shock on the left through April. This is monthly price data of the R3 steer price. And then the figure on the right is the weekly slaughter in the factories for prime cattle. And you can see that we've had a very dramatic reduction in prices versus last year. And from the onset of the public health restrictions in March, quite a significant drop off in the throughput in factories. With that supply side, that demand adjustment coming in terms of what factories are demanding, there is accumulated stocks on farms, and we're assuming that those extra animals cost the farmer something to maintain in terms of feed usage that farmers have to basically to do. But if we keep all those animals on farm and at the end of the year they're still there, that is a positive stock adjustment. So we've tried to factor that in as well in terms of what the impact of all this means in terms of family farm income and ultimately in the national accounts contribution that agriculture makes. These are the headline numbers for the cattle rearing farms. We're looking at our 2020 forecast pre-COVID of about 9.4 thousand pounds on the average cattle rearing farm, with scenario 1 where output prices decline by 10%, being reflected in a decline of family farm income, the average family farm income of almost 40%. So a very dramatic decline. Now, some people wonder, how do you get such a big dramatic decline in income if the price shock is only of the order of 10%? And it's not that hard. You've got to remember that we're not seeing very much adjustment in the cost side. And when you reduce the output value side by 10 or more percent, it very quickly translates into a much larger change in the income story. The more severe scenarios 2 and 3, from the perspective of the beef industry, you're looking at a 15% price shock relative to last year, or a 20% price shock relative to last year, and they are reflected in progressively more dramatic declines in the family farm income on the average cattle rearing farm of 60 and almost 80% if prices were to decline by 20% and the output volume marketed by farms was to decline by 10%. Now, we're not looking at that scenario. 3 looks less likely at the moment, but we're probably going to end up somewhere around scenario 1 to 2 for the beef, the cattle rearing family farm system. And similarly for the cattle other farm systems, the same type of price shocks assumed, same type of output volume adjustment, and the impacts on the average farm income are again very dramatic, even for the most benign scenario, with a 40% reduction in family farm income relative to where we thought we would be this year if we didn't have COVID. Quickly on to sheep in terms of my concluding slides. To date, prices for lamb have been above and are just kind of converging on where they were last year, week on week, when we compare 2020 to 2019. But we're now moving into the sort of the peak period in terms of delivery of spring lamb to factories. And if the food service industry, particularly in our continental markets, remains depressed, and I think it will, we are likely to see that red line, that 2020 price story, go below the path of prices that farmers received in 2019, and that the story will, for sheep farmers, will converge towards the outcome for beef farmers. So in our scenario analysis, just to shift on to the headline slide, again, we're assuming a 10, 15, and 20% reduction in the lamb prices versus last year, and some adjustment in the output volume as well, with the cost adjustments that we've talked through. And that leads to, again, smaller, though still very dramatic reductions in family farm income in the most benign scenario of almost 30%, increasing towards 60% for more severe scenarios in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the average sheep farm income. And I'll pass over to Fiona to talk now.
Okay, thanks for that, Kevin. So what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides is the effect of the COVID-19 scenarios that Kevin has outlined for income on tillage farms. So Kevin, you might just do the next slide for me there, please. So just to give a bit of a backstory here, when we're talking about income on specialist tillage farms, the last time we carried out a comprehensive update on incomes, potential incomes for 2020 was in November 2019. But since last November, we've had quite substantial supply and demand shocks pertaining to specialist tillage farms in Ireland. So some of those are COVID-19 related, while others are non-COVID related. And it's very difficult to directly assign causality, whether they're COVID or non-COVID. But so far in 2020, I think it's safe enough to say that most of the impacts from supply and demand are non-COVID related, driven by supply prospects at harvest 2020. So on foot of this, we carried out an update of the pre-COVID scenario for tillage farms at the back end of March 2020. And over on top of that forecast, pre-COVID forecast for incomes, we superimposed our 3 separate COVID-19 scenarios to look at the potential income effect of COVID. Okay, next slide there, please. So the tillage outlook for 2020 pre-COVID, what were we talking about? We're looking at harvest prices for cereals for 2020 for wheat and barley. So wheat prices up about 10% on the harvest prices that prevailed at harvest 2019, and barley prices at a par with those that prevailed at harvest 19, and that's mainly to do with the supply and demand dynamics on the global balance sheet. Cereal production, a decrease due to reduced winter sowing that we saw on foot of weather conditions at harvest or at sowing time, and then we're assuming trend yields. We already baked in seed and fertilizer prices would be lower than in 2019, giving us a pre-COVID family farm income of €30,000 for 2020 before we start looking at the assumptions for COVID. So next slide there. So what are the main specific risk factors associated with specialist tillage farming for COVID-19? To start with, we'll look at demand for ethanol and the knock-on effects of the reduction in crude oil prices that prevailed since beginning of March of this year, and the knock-on effect of the reduction in demand for bioethanol in the US in particular, a fall off in demand for maize for those purposes. And that maize then has to find an alternative home. It goes on to the feed supply, and so an increase in supply of feed maize, which will have a potential negative effect on cereal prices internationally. And we're assigning that as a direct COVID factor. Next up is the malting barley story. And what we've seen so far is a reduction in demand for alcohol outside of the house since lockdown. And this is having a twofold increase on the barley story in Ireland here. First is a reduction in the demand for malting barley and a reduction in the contracted tonnage of malting barley at farm level. And then again, the second impact is that malting barley, or that barley that was destined originally for the malting barley heap, then has to find another home. It goes on to the feed heap side, the feed story then, or the price for feed barley then having a negative trajectory. So next up then is the potential impact of meat demand and the reduction in demand in food service in particular across the EU. So based on the story that Kevin has already outlined, this could have a potential negative effect on the demand for concentrates here in Ireland, with a potential bearish or negative effect on cereal prices. But we also need to remember that there's, on average, a very substantial subsidiary beef enterprise on what we call specialist tillage farms here in Ireland, with about 30% of the gross output on these specialist tillage farms having a subsidiary beef enterprise. And if we factor in the negative news story, which Kevin has already talked about for that beef enterprise, this could potentially have a negative impact on income on tillage farms. Also on the negative side, possible decrease in the demand for straw. And we also need to always keep in the back of our mind that cereals prices here in Ireland are dictated on the international balance sheet. So how exchange rates might fare out as the pandemic moves on, that could have a negative effect on cereal prices here in Ireland. So next slide there. So just a summary in terms of what we're looking at for prices for harvest 2020. At the moment, spot and future prices are showing an increase or on a par with 2019. But all market reports and sentiment appear to be forecasting mostly bearish or negative set of consequences as the year progresses, directly associated with COVID. But the big unknown is when this will materialise, if it will materialise, and how big the magnitude will be. So that we then went with looking at 3 separate scenarios. So here on the right-hand side, in the same format as Kevin has already presented for beef and sheep, we're looking at 3 separate scenarios for tillage farms. In scenario 1, we're looking at wheat price up by 10% compared to 2019, because that's the spot and future prices that are prevailing out there at the moment. And we're looking at barley prices of no change, with a slightly negative story on barley compared to wheat. So scenario 1, prices for wheat up 10%, scenario 2, no change in wheat prices, and scenario 3 being the most negative, with wheat prices down by 10%. And barley following a similar format, with barley prices down by most in scenario 3 by 20%. So the overall impact of these price changes, and also the input story, the main input price change is that pertaining to fuel costs, with fuel costs declining by 30% across the 3 scenarios. The overall impact is that in scenario 1 on specialist tillage farms in Ireland, we're looking at a decline in family farm income of 6% relative to the pre-COVID scenario for 2020. And fast forward into scenario 3, with family farm income declining by over 40% compared to the €30,000 pre-COVID scenario. So a range of between 6% and 41%, depending on the scenario that you're looking at. And we're probably looking at a possibility of somewhere between scenario 1 and scenario 2 for its potential impact on tillage farms in Ireland. Okay, so that finishes up the tillage story, and I'll hand you over now to Trevor to do the dairy story.
Okay, thanks very much, Fiona, for that. If you want to move on there, Kevin, to the next slide. Just want to start by talking about the issue of supply capacity or processing capacity, more particularly in the sector. This chart here just shows you the extent of the increase in production that has taken place in the last 5-6 years. And as you can see, the peak level of production now in the summer or in May is exceeding 1 billion litres. So that's kind of where we are at the current point in time. We haven't had any issues with processing capacity on the dairy side yet. That risk hasn't completely gone away. But in the analysis we're looking at here, we're assuming that all milk that's actually produced ultimately does get processed, and that there isn't any question of capacity going offline due to COVID-19 issues. The dotted line there just shows you where we are in terms of production for 2020. And the story, I mean, it's a story of a small increase. We have about 5% more cows in the system, so you might have thought that we might actually see production growing at a slightly stronger rate than it actually is, but we're trending marginally above where we were in 2019 in terms of production so far for this year. I suppose the conditions in recent weeks aren't going to help either in terms of the lack of rainfall that we've seen. If you want to go to the next slide there, Kevin. I think you've jumped across one. Okay, maybe you haven't, okay. What I wanted to mention also, of course, obviously, in respect to the previous slide, is the fact that because we have such a seasonal milk production profile, the price level in the short term is going to be extremely important, because you have about 3/4 of the total milk production delivered over a 6-month period. So prices in the short term obviously will have a very significant impact on the overall average milk price level for the year. This chart here is just focusing on our product mix. Always difficult to get actual production numbers for Ireland due to concerns about confidentiality and what have you. But we get a good snapshot anyway, at least from the export data. And I guess the key points here to remind you are that even though There have been substantial developments over the last 20 years in terms of increasing cheese production in Ireland and infant formula and getting value from whey production. We are still quite heavily invested in butter and powder production. And in more recent times in particular, we've seen the emergence of a fat-filled powder as an alternative to skim milk powder production. So, you know, there is still quite a significant chunk of our product mix going into butter and powder. Next slide, Kevin, please. And if we just look at what has been happening on initially here now on the skim milk powder market and the butter market, we'll see that prices have begun to dip since the COVID concerns emerged, and prices have begun to move back towards the intervention level, even though they haven't quite reached there at that point just yet. And it's important also to reflect that, you know, skim milk powder market is a market that was in the doldrums for quite an extended period of time. We had a huge build-up of stocks in 17 and 18, which were only finally eliminated last year, and you can see the recovery in prices that took place then. So we're back into difficult territory in terms of skim milk powder prices again, now that COVID has emerged. Next slide, Kevin. Story on the butter side, obviously is a much more dramatic one where we saw historically high levels of butter prices in which did a lot, I suppose, to offset the fact that skim milk powder prices were in the doldrums. We've seen butter prices fall to some extent also in the context of COVID-19, but prices are still a good deal above the intervention level, and we've no expectation that they will go anywhere near the intervention level in reality. But I guess one of the points to make here is that, you know, the fact that we have now quite depressed skim milk powder prices isn't being offset by a very buoyant butter price, as was the situation, we'll say, if you go back into 2018. So the overall return from butter and skim now is not anything like as good as it was 2 years ago. Next slide, Kevin. Here, this looks a bit complicated, but it's a very simple slide. Really, I'm just trying to bring home to you the fact that Irish milk prices are more volatile than either the EU average or even just the French price, which I'm also showing here for comparison purposes. And it works both ways for us. These prices now are in euro per 100 kg, which are near enough to prices per litre for the purposes of our discussion here. Anyway, the key point here is the volatility, not the actual levels. And as you can see here, in times of surplus, the Irish milk price fares disproportionately badly, and in times of scarcity, we do disproportionately well relative to any measure of whether it's the French price or the EU average price that you're actually talking about. So our milk price is fundamentally more volatile, and that's not completely unexpected in the sense that we have a much greater dependency on export markets. You know, we're a residual supplier in terms of dairy products into some markets. Next slide, Kevin. So if you want to think about what the outlook for the dairy sector in Ireland was for 2020 before COVID arrived, it was actually quite a good one. There weren't any real concerns about any potential for a reduction in milk price. A fairly stable milk price seemed in the offing. And as I mentioned earlier, with the further addition of dairy cows, you know, the sector was set to see further expansion in milk production and a further increase in the average family farm income in dairy farming of the order of about €6,000. Now, that situation has obviously deteriorated on foot of COVID, and similar to the other analysis, we've looked at this by way of 3 different scenarios. So if you want to go to the next slide, Kevin, please. So what we mainly did was we based this around reductions in the milk price ranging from 10% in scenario 1 here out as far as 20% in scenario 3. We also made some limited changes to our expectations with respect to milk production for the year, on the basis that dairy farmers do have that little bit more flexibility to adjust their production than we'll say meat producers. So under these different scenarios, as the price gets progressively worse, there is a little bit of an impact on the overall milk production for the year as well. So that compounds the impact, we'll say, of the fall in milk price. Where we are at the moment in terms of market development is probably more in line with scenario 1 here, which by our estimation would result in a reduction in family farm income of just over 20%. You know, that's not to say that we've have actually reached the bottom right now. Prices have stabilized, but there is unsold product out there, and that product will have to be marketed at some point. And it's, you know, it's the same situation in respect to other commodity markets. But under scenario 2 here, we see a reduction in income of 36%, and then the extreme scenario, which we probably don't need to entertain, at least for this point, you would have a situation where average family farm income would pretty much halve on dairy farms. But you know, there would need to be some very significant developments in terms of a reversal of the success in terms of suppressing the virus, I think, to get us into the scenario 3 type of environment. Next slide, please, Kevin. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much a summary of what I've just said, I guess. You know, you can see there the range of possible income reductions from 21 out to minus 49%. Quite what happens on milk volume will depend to some extent also on weather conditions, as is the typical thing in any year in Ireland. But obviously, the further the milk price reductions we see, the less likely we are to see any significant expansion in milk production for the year as a whole. So next slide, Kevin. So I just want to pull together what Kevin, Fiona and I have just been saying here and present them to you in a couple of ways. Firstly, just in terms of aggregating across and weighting up the different income stories for the different sectors. Under the 3 scenarios we've actually looked at, and we've represented them in 2 ways, I guess. Firstly, what the outcome for 2020 would be compared to last year, but probably a more reasoned or a more fair, I guess, reflection of the impact would be to look at it compared to what we would have expected to happen this year had COVID not emerged. As you can see there in the bottom row of the table, we're talking about reductions in the average family farm income in Ireland ranging from over 25% up to 56% here. And we can do a similar piece of work, but more broadly across all of agriculture, because we exclude some sectors from this analysis. But if we take a broader measure of agricultural income, more in line with the standard definition of agricultural income used by the CSO, we can make a similar calculation. And again, you know, these numbers should be different, but they shouldn't be too different. And as you can see, they're not too different. The range here is about minus 22% under scenario 1 up to minus 50% on scenario 3. And I guess one of the points we should make as well is that, you know, we may end up with a scenario 1 outcome for one sector, but it doesn't follow that all sectors will end with the same scenario outcome. So it'll be quite hard to pin down where we do end up this year in terms of the income story, but somewhere in the territory of minus 20% anyway at the moment seems like a likely outcome, unless we see further deterioration in market situations. Next slide, Kevin. There's one more slide, is there? Yeah. Yep. So, you know, okay, there has been a COVID impact. Prices to some extent have stabilized. Is the whole thing over? I think that is hard to call, and I think it's perhaps overly optimistic to imagine that the worst has already passed. Fair enough, on the dairy side, you know, we haven't really seen product going into intervention yet, but, you know, there is unsold product out there, and that will need to find a home eventually. Similarly, on the beef side, we've seen that one of the factors that has helped markets to stabilise has been a reduction in slaughtering around Europe. So to some extent, what's been happening in Europe has been different to what's been happening in the US. In some sense, in Europe, we seem to be pushing the problem out ahead of us a little bit, whereas in the US, there has been more of an acceptance to take it on the nose, I think, immediately. And that'll probably be reflected in the pace of the recovery that we see in those two markets as well. You know, I think we would expect the US prices to recover more quickly than will be the case in the European Union. We seem to be more determined to drag the thing out over a more extended period. So, I mean, there is a potential for a very significant surplus of skim milk powder. That still remains a risk. And at some point into the future, beef slaughtering will have to pick up. You know, these animals that haven't been slaughtered are going to have to be slaughtered eventually for cash flow reasons, as opposed to any other kind of reason. So, I mean, we're not out of the woods yet, I think, in terms of commodity price reductions. So there could be further downward pressure on prices, and the stability that we see at the moment could be the calm before prices deteriorate a bit further. So I think that's it, Kevin, isn't it? And that's the final slide. So I guess we'll pass you back now to Mark.
Okay.
Thank you all. If I could ask you all to switch back on your video cameras as well, please. So thank you for those excellent presentations. Not easy messages to deliver. Kieran, if we could start with you. We have lots and lots of questions coming through here, so please do, to anybody who's tuned in, to continue sending through questions. With your permission, we might keep going beyond the 1:45 time that we had originally indicated. So
you're blocking my video for some reason. I'm trying to restart it, and it's
okay. I'll have a look at that now. So Kieran, if you could switch on your microphone for us as well, please, Kieran. Just are we looking at austerity as a near inevitability now at this stage?
Well, I think it's a very interesting, timely question. I suppose our outlook on that is that at the moment, what we need to do is to stabilize the economy as much as possible in terms of policy. This is an exceptional shock, if you like, in the sense that it has come out of left field. The Irish economy up until the end of February was performing very, very strongly. In fact, the early indicators for this year were very, very positive. So the shock has come out of nowhere. It's not really down to anything that the Irish government or policymakers have done domestically or even internationally. So you have to kind of bear that in mind in terms of the response. And I think the response needs to be to smooth the path as much as possible. That means the government has to spend a lot of money. It means that the deficit is going to increase significantly this year, possibly next year, and even the year after. But I think that has got to be the appropriate policy stance at this stage. I think it's too early to talk about austerity. It's too early to talk about the correction of the public finances. That will come at some stage, but I think in the short to medium term, the focus has got to be on stabilizing economic activity through the support mechanisms that have already been put in place in terms of the income supports and supports for small businesses, and then the possibility even of a stimulus, a broader based stimulus, to try and reignite and re-stimulate economic activity through the latter half of this year and into next year.
And Kieran, does the ESRI have a view on this recession? We'll call it whether will it be a V, U, or L-shaped type of a response?
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw one of the other questions was concerning Brexit, which of course is hugely relevant. I suppose I should have pointed out at the outset that we really have only focused on 2020 in terms of our analysis on the premise that it's so difficult to kind of figure out what's going to happen in the current year, that to try and think about 2021, which we would normally do. Normally our forecast would be for this year and next year. But it's just so hard to kind of to assess what is likely to happen, mainly because of the huge uncertainty still around the medical issue and the spread of the virus and the like. I think at this point, I mean, it's probably fair to say that the prospect of a V-shaped recovery is very unlikely. If you take the government's even 5-phase plan to continue with social distancing and physical distancing into into August and beyond, that means really we're not likely to have normal, in inverted commas, economic activity even by the end of the year. And therefore, the prospect of a very sharp and quick recovery has probably receded considerably. So you are looking at a more sluggish kind of, if you want to call it, U-shaped type recovery, which I think brings us into 2021 and possibly even into 2022 before the economy really gets back to the kind of rates of growth that we had before this. But the one silver lining I would say is that the economy was in very good health going into this crisis. Certainly, it's one of the most dynamic performing economies across the Euro area and the European Union over the last 5 or 6 years. So if we get it right in terms of the right policy response now, in terms of stabilizing and minimizing the impact of the shock, then I think there's good reason to believe that the economy will still come out of this quite strong when, when the worst of the medical episode has passed.
Kevin, if I could turn to you, we have, little prospect of the EU restaurant demand recovering fast, hard Brexit, and acceleration of EU and national climate policy. Is this a perfect storm for the Irish beef sector as a mass export product for the next year?
I think the COVID thing is a big shock, and as Kieran said, mixing together COVID and Brexit together is very difficult to be very confident about what you'd forecast. But I think they're both negative, and all of our analysis for the last 3 years has always highlighted the vulnerability and the extreme exposure of the beef sector to Brexit. And what this analysis, this partial analysis shows is that it's similarly exposed on the COVID side in terms of its dependence on the food service industry in the UK and in continental Europe. So there's no way to escape the conclusion that the combination of the two just is an even bigger demand headache for the beef sector in Ireland. And it means that it's likely that the weak demand side picture that we're talking about this year will persist through into 2021 at the very least. Super contingent on what happens on the Brexit story, and we take our British friends' statements at face value. They're not going to extend the transition period. If we look at what's happening in terms of negotiations, it seems that they seem to be going nowhere very fast. So it does add up to a very big problem for the beef sector. But the beef sector, these type of industries don't disappear overnight. So I don't think the prospect of the beef sector stopping or shutting down is anywhere on the horizon. But the prospects for the beef sector, particularly the specialized beef sector out of the suckle cow herd, are dimming, and they weren't very bright to start with. So it's not a very positive outlook at all for the Irish beef sector. But everybody needs to remember, as long as we have a very dynamic dairy sector, that milk comes along with calves, and there will be a supply of beef from that dairy industry that's there to be turned and will be turned into beef by somebody in Ireland. So the beef industry and both at the farm level and at the meat processing industry level is not going away anytime.
Trevor, if I could turn to you, we have a question here in relation to the emergence of increased protectionism from major economic destinations that we trade with. What is your feeling of how that's going to pan out for Ireland?
Hi Mark, I hope you can hear me okay. One of my neighbours decided it would be a great time to cut the grass. So I think it's a possibility. I think time will tell whether it's of any real significance. There seems to be an increase in people's concerns about the provenance of what they eat. I mean, I would caution and remind people that this COVID outbreak came out of consumption of wild animals as opposed to domesticated animals. I've seen some commentary in the media the last few days critical of commercial agriculture and trying to associate it with a pandemic like this, which is a bit absurd, to be honest. I think there is a concern there. it could be something that's exploited as well to some extent by people who want to see renationalisation happening anyway for protectionist reasons, just to kind of protect their own domestic market. We've even seen that in the context of some countries in Europe. I mean, you know, even if you just look at the removal of the dairy quota, I mean, there's a body of countries in Europe still who are extremely unhappy that ever happened. And, you know, as a way of insulating themselves from competition from the likes of Ireland, you know, pushing a kind of a protectionist agenda would suit them very well on the back of some kind of human health concern.
Trevor, while you have the stage there, question here in relation to what extent is demand reduction in dairy related to COVID-related supply chain challenges rather than actual reduced consumer demand?
Yeah, I see that question coming in, I think, from Michael Barry. I don't know the answer to that one, Michael. To be honest, I'm aware that when this thing started, there was a good deal of concern, all right, about the availability of containers and what have you. I haven't heard people talking about that to anything like the same extent more recently, but I'm not close enough to what's happening on the ground to be able to comment on that one, to be honest.
Okay.
Mark, if I could just add to what Trevor was saying there on the sort of the renationalisation and the globalisation agenda. I think there is a strong narrative out there about, you know, reshoring industries and kind of the conclusions that these complex supply chains are in some sense inherently vulnerable and a bad idea, and that we need to shorten them. And I think there's a chap called Alan Beattie who writes for Financial Times who kind of quoted an American writer, H.L. Mencken, saying that for every complex problem, there's always a clear and simple solution, but that is also wrong. And I think that the place of the Irish agri-food sector in what are global value chains needs to be remembered, and that sort of simple ideas that we can all just basically go back to Sinn Féin, Mayfain type of economic policies is really one that will come with enormous costs for everybody, consumers and producers. So we need to basically to call those out when people put them abroad as the easy answer. There is no easy answer. I think we need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And Ireland has benefited enormously from globalization, including the Irish agri-food sector. And we need to remember that, again, most of our consumers are not Irish. They are people in other markets, companies in other markets, and final consumers. And that will continue to be the case.
Mark, can I just come back in, or do you?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I'd share very much what Kevin has said there about the supply chain issue, but just I make two quick responses, or one observation and one response. So one on the Brexit issue, and I think it's just an important point to note. We kind of came across this ourselves in looking at Brexit last year, which is that very often when we look at Brexit, we tend to look, and even economists tend to do, is we tend to look kind of into the future, and we kind of think, well, what would the impact of Brexit be in terms of future trade arrangements or trade agreements and WTO style agreements, etc. And we tend to look at it down the line, and a lot of the work we would have done with Cosmo, our macroeconometric model, would have been to project 10 years ahead and see what the impacts would be. But what we have noted, and I think this is probably relevant again in the present climate, is the whole issue around the uncertainty around Brexit has a negative economic impact in of itself. So even if an agreement is reached at the end of on the 12th hour, which is satisfactory, there is still the potential for a lot of damage to occur in the meantime because of people's uncertainty. And we saw that very much last year with the way in which, for instance, consumer sentiment was impacted all through the discussion around Brexit and the possibility of a no deal, etc. That's the first point. The second point is just an observation. It's interesting just to look at the results there for family farm incomes and the substantial impact of COVID-19 on family farm incomes, and so much that it's actually greater than almost the output effect. Because what you tend to see from a macro perspective, and certainly the work that my colleagues on the tax benefit side in the ESRI have shown, is that actually the fall off in disposable household incomes are likely to be a lot less than the fall off in economic output. So if we're talking about economic output falling by 12 or 13% this year because of COVID, family incomes are likely to fall by probably even just half of that on average. So somewhere in the region of 6 or 7%. And that's mainly due to the very substantial, I suppose, package that was introduced in terms of the pandemic payments and the like. So just interesting to note the contrast between, you know, the effect of COVID in an agricultural context in terms of its impact on family farm incomes compared to output, and the contrasting picture at a more macro perspective where, as I said, economic output effect will be probably much more significant than the effect on household income levels.
Just to come to add to that the family farm income that we're talking about is the business income, not the family household income. So I think it's important to stress that family farmers and family farm members are as entitled as any other citizen or a resident in the state for these pandemic support payments. And at a household level, I would expect that the ESRI type analysis would be borne out for farm households as any other household really. What we're looking at here is the business income shock that's coming from the family farm. The family component in that title might be a bit might divert people into thinking there's a story here that there isn't. I would expect that what I take from the stories that our GDP equivalent shock, our operating surplus, is actually not that different at all from the output shock that you guys are reporting in terms of the GDP story for your three scenarios. So it's a jargon here in terms of what we call family income and what other people call family income. So yeah.
Fiona, could I ask you a question? With the significant reduction in ethanol production, we have a question here: will there be an associated reduction in the availability of grain byproducts, proteins, for example?
Yeah, so that has been talked about all right, Mark, when you read the media reports and potential impacts of COVID for the tillage sector, the drop-off on those byproducts, and particularly for an importing country like Ireland, where we're a net importer to feed the livestock sector, and particularly those type of byproducts can be important in any given year. But I think, to be honest with you, that really is a sidebar issue in terms of the potential impact for tillage farms here in Ireland and the overall potential impact on cereal prices. Like, I think that is probably a small component in terms of the byproducts of the overall impact on cereal prices. So when I'm talking about tillage farm income, the importance of protein crops is very small in terms of an average specialist tillage farm in this country. Now, that is a possible win in terms of the availability of those type of mid-proteins coming into the country. But at the end of the day, supply responses at farm level at this stage that farm gate is closed, so we can't ramp up production of those proteins in any short time. So overall, unfortunately, it is a negative news story on the tillage side and the possible implications for cereal prices. But if we were to look at one light at the end of the tunnel, I suppose, or one niche market, it is the availability of those additional byproducts, distillers' grains, things like that.
Could I extend that question? I mean, you know, we're obviously we're hearing lots of negative stories at the moment around the pandemic, but are there opportunities there where policies that could be introduced to make the whole supply chain more resilient? You know, can we look at this, flip this crisis on its head and say, well, is there a moment here where we can look at introducing some policies or measures to create more resilience in the system?
Well, I think the European agri-food system has been shown to be amazingly resilient. In fact, in the face of the pandemic, you know, while there were short-run shortages on supermarket shelves in the first few weeks, you know, there's nobody who's been unable to get food, get that food supply. Maybe not quite the variety of flours in supermarkets that my wife would have liked to see continue. But there's been no shortage of, you know, if you wanted to bake bread, you could have gotten flour or meat or dairy products. So I think
resilience, you know, for that, certainly from a consumer's perspective, but perhaps looking back down the supply chain, looking at your primary producers, processors, and so forth.
I mean, I think that there are income supports to farmers already in European policy. I think what, insofar as we want to keep farmers farming and delivering the other co-products that go along with that, about in terms of landscape services and so on, there's a rationale for continued taxpayer support of farm incomes in terms of what it delivers from a food supply perspective and from the perspective of supply of public goods. I don't think that's going to change, but I would doubt, beyond a short-run emergency income response, support response from government nationally, which is already happening, in terms of the general support payments to farmers like everybody else, and whatever comes from the European Union in terms of supporting incomes in the short run in the face of the pandemic. I think it will be difficult in the current circumstances to see a large increase in that taxpayer-funded income support to make farm businesses more resilient to another pandemic-like shock that might come down the road in the future. Hopefully, it won't come down the road. I mean, I think the resilience piece will be about changing our behaviour to make these type of pandemics less likely. So, continue to observe higher health, hand hygiene and so on into the future. That would be more important. That would be part of the new normal. But I wouldn't expect that the European taxpayers will be willing to devote a lot more. The reality is that there'll be a lot more people looking for support from the European budget and from national budgets as we move out of the pandemic into the post-pandemic phase. And I think the challenge will be to retain the current levels of support we have for the sector in terms of resilience in the new CAP, for example, and that will be framed for the next, framing agriculture's prospects for the next 7 years.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Unfortunately, time is up against us, and so what I'd like to do, just a point to we have had a lot of questions in relation to other sectors such as pigs, poultry and forestry. So I understand that because of the urgency in putting these figures together, this paper, that these weren't included for the moment, but I imagine there will be some work done on that in the near future. Could I ask Professor Boyle to say some concluding remarks, and just before we come to that, just to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available on the Teagasc YouTube channel, along with the presentations will also be available on the Teagasc website. So Jerry, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. I'd just like to conclude by thanking all of you for participating in the webinar, and a special word of thanks to my colleagues, and in particular to our guest, Professor McQuinn, Kieran McQuinn, for the excellent presentations. From a Teagasc perspective, I guess our job will be to focus on assisting farmers to be resilient in the face of the shocks they're experiencing. And we would always emphasize the importance of adopting sound management practices, and in particular, in the current circumstances, the careful management of cash flow. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be rolling out a cash flow program that has been of huge assistance in the past. And basically, we're advising farmers to take even just 5 minutes to analyze their cash flow situation, and that will help. So, thank you.